This section gives you additional information on the technique of knitting. Knitting. Module 1 Introduction. Knitting is a method by which thread or yarn is turned into cloth or other fine crafts. Knitted fabric consists of consecutive rows of loops called stitches. As each row progresses, a new loop is pulled through an existing loop. The active stitches are held on a needle until another loop can be passed through them. This process eventually results in a final product, often a garment. Knitting may be done by hand or by machine. There exist numerous styles and methods of hand knitting. Different yarns and knitting needles may be used to achieve different end products by giving the final piece a different color, texture, weight, and/or integrity. Using needles of varying shape and thickness as well as different varieties of yarn can also change the effect. The word is derived from knot, thought to originate from the Dutch verb knooten, which is similar to the Old English knitten to knot. One of the earliest known examples of knitting was cotton socks with stranded knit color patterns found in Egypt from the end of the first millennium AD. Originally a male-only occupation, the first knitting trade guild was started in Paris in 1527. With the invention of the knitting machine, however, knitting by hand became a useful but non-essential craft. Similar to quilting, spinning, and needlepoint, knitting became a leisure activity. Hand knitting has gone into and out of fashion many times in the last 2 centuries, and at the turn of the 21st century, it is enjoying a revival. According to the industry group Craft Yarn Council of America, the number of women knitters in the United States aged 25 to 35 increased 150% in the 2 years between 2002 and 2004. The latest incarnation is less about the make do and mend attitude of the 1940s and early 50s and more about making a statement about individuality as well as developing an innate sense of community. During the 1940s, English knitting rose in popularity while continental knitting fell. This is due to the fact that continental knitting originated within Germany and was spread by immigrants. During World War II, continental knitting fell out of style due to its relationship with Germany. It wasn't until Elizabeth Zimmermann publicized continental knitting in the 1980s that it again was popularized. This woman is knitting at a coffee shop. Knitting is often done in a group with other knitters. Although knitting may have had a reputation as hobby one does alone, it is becoming more and more of a social activity. Knitting guilds and other knitting groups or knitting clubs are becoming exceedingly popular. Additionally, many contemporary knitters have an interest in blogging about their knitting, patterns, and techniques or joining a virtual community focused on knitting such as Ravelry, affectionately known as Rav to fiber lovers around the world. There are also a number of popular knitting podcasts such as the Manic Purl podcast and the Savvy Girls podcast. Contemporary knitting groups may be referred to in the US as a stitch and bitch, where a group of knitters get together to work on projects, discuss patterns, troubleshoot their work and just socialize. In the UK, the term has been knitting circle since the early 20th century. The topology of a knitted fabric is relatively complex. Unlike woven fabrics, where strands usually run straight horizontally and vertically, yarn that has been knitted follows a loopy path along its row, as with the red strand in the diagram at left, in which the loops of one row have all been pulled through the loops of the row below it. Because there is no single straight line of yarn anywhere in the pattern, a knitted piece can stretch in all directions. This elasticity is unavailable from woven fabrics which only stretch along the bias. Many modern stretchy garments, even as they rely on elastic synthetic materials for some stretch, also achieve at least some of their stretch through knitted patterns. The basic knitted fabric, as in the diagram and usually called a stocking or stockinette pattern, has a definite right side and wrong side. On the right side, the visible portions of the loops are the verticals connecting two rows arranged in a grid of V shapes. On the wrong side, the ends of the loops are visible, both the tops and bottoms, creating a much more bumpy texture sometimes called reverse stockinette. Despite being the wrong side, reverse stockinette is frequently used as a pattern in its own right. Because the yarn holding rows together is all on the front and the yarn holding side-by-side stitches together is all on the back, stockinette fabric has a strong tendency to curl towards the front on the top and bottom and toward the back on the left and right side. Stitches can be worked from either side and various patterns are created by mixing regular knit stitches with the wrong side stitches known as purl stitches, either in columns, ribbing, rows, garter or welting, or more complex patterns. Each such fabric has different properties. A garter stitch has much more vertical stretch, while ribbing stretches much more horizontally. Because of their front-back symmetry, these two fabrics have little curl, making them popular as edging even when their stretch properties are not desired. Different combinations of knit and purl stitches, along with more advanced techniques, generate fabrics of considerably variable consistency, from gauzy to very dense, from highly stretchy to relatively stiff, from flat to tightly curled, and so on. The most common texture for a knitted garment is that generated by the flat stockinette stitch as seen, though very small in machine-made stockings and t-shirts, which is worked in the round as nothing but knit stitches and worked flat as alternating rows of knit and purl. Other simple textures can be made with nothing but knit and purl stitches, including garter stitch, ribbing, and moss and seed stitches. Adding a slip stitch where a loop is passed from one needle to the other allows for a wide range of textures including heel and linen stitches and a number of more complicated patterns. Some more advanced knitting techniques create a surprising variety of complex textures. Combining certain increases which can create small eyelet holes in the resulting fabric with assorted decreases is key to creating knitted lace, a very open fabric resembling lace. Changing the order of stitches from one row to the next, usually with the help of a cable needle or stitch holder, is key to cable knitting, producing an endless variety of cables, honeycombs, ropes, and Aran sweater patterning. Entrelac forms a rich checkerboard texture by knitting small squares, picking up their side edges, and knitting more squares to continue the piece. The appearance of a garment is also affected by the weight of the yarn, which describes the thickness of the spun fiber. The thicker the yarn, the more visible and apparent stitches will be. The thinner the yarn, the finer the texture. Plenty of finished knitting projects never use more than a single color of yarn, but there are many ways to work in multiple colors. Some yarns are dyed to be either variegated, that is changing color every few stitches in a random fashion, or self-striping, changing every few rows. More complicated techniques permit large fields of color. In tarsia, for example, busy small-scale patterns of color such as fair isle or both, double knitting and slip stitch color, for example. Yarn with multiple shades of the same hue are called ombre, while a yarn with multiple hues may be known as a given colorway. A green, red, and yellow yarn may be dubbed the parrot colorway by its manufacturer, for example. Heathered yarns contain small amounts of fiber of different colors, while tweed yarns may have greater amounts of different color fibers. Like weaving, knitting is a technique for producing a two-dimensional fabric made from a one-dimensional yarn or thread. In weaving, threads are always straight, running parallel either lengthwise, warp threads, or crosswise, weft threads. By contrast, the yarn in knitted fabrics follows a meandering path or a course, forming symmetric loops, also called bites, symmetrically above and below the mean path of the yarn. These meandering loops can be stretched easily in different directions, which gives knitting much more elasticity than woven fabrics. Depending on the yarn and knitting pattern, knitted garments can stretch as much as 500%. For this reason, knitting was initially developed for garments that must be elastic or stretch in response to the wearer's motions, such as socks and hosiery. For comparison, woven garments stretch mainly along one direction, the bias, and are not very elastic, unless they are woven from stretchable material such as spandex. Knitted garments are often more form-fitting than woven garments since their elasticity allows them to follow the body's curvature closely. By contrast, curvature is introduced into most woven garments only with sewn darts, flares, gussets, and gores, the seams of which lower the elasticity of the woven fabric still further. Extra curvature can be introduced into knitted garments without seams, as in the heel of a sock. The effect of darts, flares, etc. can be obtained with short rows or by increasing or decreasing the number of stitches. Thread used in weaving is usually much finer than the yarn used in knitting, which can give the knitted fabric more bulk and less drape than a woven fabric. Structure of stockinette, a common knitted fabric. The meandering red path defines one course, the path of the yarn through the fabric. The uppermost white loops are unsecured and active, but they secure the red loops suspended from them. In turn, the red loops secure the white loops just below them, which in turn secure the loops below them, and so on. If they are not secured, the loops of a knitted course will come undone when the yarn is pulled. This is known as ripping out, unraveling knitting, or humorously frogging because you rip it. This sounds like a frog croaking. To secure a stitch, at least one new loop is passed through it. Although the new stitch is itself unsecured, active or live, it secures the stitches suspended from it. A sequence of stitches in which each stitch is suspended from the next is called a wale. To secure the initial stitches of a knitted fabric, a method for casting on is used. To secure the final stitches in a wale, one uses a method of binding off. During knitting, the active stitches are secured mechanically either from individual hooks in knitting machines or from a knitting needle or frame in the hand knitting. There are two major varieties of knitting, weft knitting and warp knitting. In the more common weft knitting, the wales are perpendicular to the course of the yarn. In warp knitting, the wales and courses run roughly parallel. In weft knitting, the entire fabric may be produced from a single yarn by adding stitches to each wale in turn, moving across the fabric as in a raster scan. By contrast, in warp knitting, one yarn is required for every wale. Since a typical piece of knitted fabric may have hundreds of wales, warp knitting is typically done by machine, whereas weft knitting is done by both hand and machine. Warp knitted fabrics such as tricot and Milanese are resistant to runs and are commonly used in lingerie. Weft knit fabrics may also be knit with multiple yarns, usually to produce interesting color patterns. The two most common approaches are intarsia and stranded color work. In intarsia, the yarns are used in well-segregated regions, for example, a red apple on a field of green. In that case, the yarns are kept on separate spools and only one is knitted at any time. In the more complex stranded approach, two or more yarns alternate repeatedly within one row and all the yarns must be carried along the row, as seen in Fair Isle sweaters. Double knitting can produce two separate knitted fabrics simultaneously. Example, two socks. However, the two fabrics are usually integrated into one, giving it great warmth and excellent drape. In securing the previous stitch in a veil, the next stitch can pass through the previous loop from either below or above. If the former, the stitch is denoted as a knit stitch or a plain stitch. If the latter, as a purl stitch. The two stitches are related in that a knit stitch seen from one side of the fabric appears as a purl stitch on the other side. The two types of stitches have a different visual effect. The knit stitches look like V's stacked vertically, whereas the purl stitches look like a wavy horizontal line across the fabric. Patterns and pictures can be created in knitted fabrics by using knit and purl stitches as pixels. However, such pixels are usually rectangular rather than square, depending on the gauge of the knitting. Individual stitches or rows of stitches may be made taller by drawing more yarn into the new loop, an elongated stitch, which is the basis for uneven knitting. A row of tall stitches may alternate with one or more rows of short stitches for an interesting visual effect. Short and tall stitches may also alternate within a row, forming a fish-like oval pattern. In the simplest knitted fabrics, all of the stitches are knit or purl. These fabrics are denoted as stockinette and reverse stockinette respectively. Vertical stripes, ribbing are possible by having alternating veils of knit and purl stitches. For example, a common choice is 2x2 ribbing in which two veils of knit stitches are followed by two veils of purl stitches. Horizontal striping, belting is also possible by alternating rows of knit and purl stitches. The simplest of these is garter stitch, so called because its great elasticity made it well suited for garters. Checkerboard patterns or basket weave are also possible, the smallest of which is known as seed stitch. The stitches alternate between knit and purl in every veil and along every row. Fabrics in which the number of knit and purl stitches are not the same, such as stockinette, have a tendency to curl. By contrast, those in which knit and purl stitches are arranged symmetrically, such as ribbing, garter stitch or seed stitch, tend to lie flat and drape well. Veils of purl stitches have a tendency to recede, whereas those of knit stitches tend to come forward. Thus, the purl waves in ribbing tend to be invisible, since the neighboring knit veils come forward. Conversely, rows of purl stitches tend to form an embossed ridge relative to a row of knit stitches. This is the basis of shadow knitting, in which the appearance of a knitted fabric changes when viewed from different directions. Typically, a new stitch is passed through a single unsecured active loop, thus lengthening that veil by one stitch. However, this need not be so. The new loop may be passed through an already secured stitch lower down on the fabric or even between secured stitches as a dip stitch. Depending on the distance between where the loop is drawn through the fabric and where it is knitted, dip stitches can produce a subtle stippling or long lines across the surface of the fabric. Example, the lower leaves of a flower. The new loop may also be passed between two stitches in the present row, thus clustering the intervening stitches. This approach is often used to produce a smocking effect in the fabric. The new loop may also be passed through two or more previous stitches, producing a decrease and merging veils together. The merged stitches need not be from the same row. For example, a tuck can be formed by knitting stitches together from two different rows, producing a raised horizontal welt on the fabric. Not every stitch in a row needs to be knitted. Some may be left, as in, and knitted on a subsequent row. This is known as slip stitch knitting. The slipped stitches are naturally longer than the knitted ones. For example, a stitch slipped for one row before knitting would be roughly twice as tall as its knitted counterparts. This can produce interesting visual effects, although the resulting fabric is more rigid because the slipped stitch pulls on its neighbors and is less deformable. Slip stitch knitting plays an important role in mosaic knitting, an important technique in hand knitting patterned fabrics. Mosaic knit fabrics tend to be stiffer than patterned fabrics produced by other methods such as fair isle knitting. In some cases, a stitch may be deliberately left unsecured by a new stitch and its veil allowed to dissemble. This is known as drop stitch knitting and produces a vertical ladder of see-through holes in the fabric corresponding to where the veil had been. Both knit and purl stitches may be twisted, usually once if at all, but sometimes twice and very rarely thrice. When seen from above, the twist can be clockwise, right yarn over left, or counterclockwise, left yarn over right. These are denoted as right and left hand plaited stitches respectively. Hand knitters generally produce right plaited stitches by knitting or purling through the back loops, that is, passing the needle through the initial stitch in an unusual way but wrapping the yarn as usual. By contrast, the left plaited stitch is generally formed by hand knitters by wrapping the yarn in the opposite way, rather than by any change in the needle. Although they are mirror images in form, right and left plaited stitches are functionally equivalent. Both types of plaited stitches give a subtle but interesting visual texture and tend to draw the fabric inwards, making it stiffer. Plaited stitches are a common method for knitting jewelry from fine metal wire. The initial and final edges of a knitted fabric are known as the cast-on and bound-off edges. The sides edges are known as the selvages. The word derives from the self edges, meaning that the stitches do not need to be secured by anything else. Many types of selvages have been developed with different elastic and ornamental properties. Vertical and horizontal edges can be introduced within a knitted fabric, example for buttonholes, by binding off and recasting on again horizontal or by knitting the fabrics on either side of a vertical edge separately. Two knitted fabrics can be joined by embroidery-based crafting methods, most commonly the Kitchener stitch. New veils can be begun from any of the edges of a knitted fabric. This is known as picking up stitches and is the basis for interlac, in which the veils run perpendicular to one another in a checkerboard pattern. Ordinarily, stitches are knitted in the same order in every row and the veils of the fabric run parallel and vertically along the fabric. However, this need not be so. The order in which stitches are knitted may be permuted so that veils cross over one another, forming a cable pattern. Cables patterns tend to draw the fabric together, making it denser and less elastic. Aran sweaters are a common form of knitted cabling. Arbitrarily complex braid patterns can be made in cable knitting with the proviso that the veils must move ever upwards. It is generally impossible for a veil to move up and then down the fabric. Knitters have developed methods for giving the illusion of a circular veil, such as appear in Celtic knots, but these are inexact approximations. However, such circular veils are possible using Swiss darning, a form of embroidery, or by knitting a tube separately and attaching it to the knitted fabric. A veil can split into two or more veils using increases, most commonly involving a yarn over. Depending on how the increase is done, there is often a hole in the fabric at the point of the increase. This is used to great effect in lace knitting, which consists of making patterns and pictures using such holes rather than with the stitches themselves. The large and many holes in lacy knitting makes it extremely elastic. For example, some Shetland wedding ring shawls are so fine that they may be drawn through a wedding ring. By combining increases and decreases, it is possible to make the direction of a veil slant away from vertical even in weft knitting. This is the basis for bias knitting and can be used for visual effect similar to the direction of a brush stroke in oil painting. Various point-like ornaments may be added to knitting for their look or to improve the wear of the fabric. Examples include various types of baubles, sequins, and beads. Long loops can also be drawn out and secured, forming a shaggy texture to the fabric. This is known as loop knitting. Additional patterns can be made on the surface of the knitted fabric using embroidery. If the embroidery resembles knitting, it is often called Swiss darning. Various closures for the garments, such as frogs and buttons, can be added. Usually, buttonholes are knitted into the garment rather than cut. Ornamental pieces may also be knitted separately and then attached using applique. For example, differently colored leaves and petals of a flower could be knit separately and applied to form the final picture. Separately knitted tubes can be applied to a knitted fabric to form complex Celtic knots and other patterns that would be difficult to knit. Unknitted yarns may be worked into knitted fabrics for warmth, as is done in tufting and weaving, also known as couching. Types. Circular knitting, also called knitting in the round, is a form of knitting that can be used to create a seamless tube. Knitting is worked in rounds, the equivalent of rows in flat knitting in a helix. Originally, circular knitting was done using a set of 4 or 5 double-pointed knitting needles. Later, circular needles were invented. A circular needle resembles two short knitting needles connected by a cable between them. Flat knitting, on the other hand, is used in its most basic form to make flat, rectangular pieces of cloth. It is done with two straight knitting needles and is worked in rows, horizontal lines of stitches. A circular knitting needle can also be used to create flat knitted pieces that are too large for ordinary straight knitting needles, such as afghans and blankets. Circular knitting is employed to create pieces that are circular or tube-shaped, such as hats, socks, mittens, and sleeves. Flat knitting is usually used to knit flat pieces like scarves, blankets, afghans, and the backs and fronts of sweaters. There is also such a thing as finger knitting. Instead of needles, fingers are used to produce a tube of knitted fabric. Felting is a hand knitter's term for fulling, a technique for joining knitted or woven wool fibers. The finished product is put in a hot wash and is agitated until it shrinks. While the knitted project is in the washing machine, it is important to check the progress. Depending on the size of the project, some may felt faster than others. The end result typically has reduced dimensions. Bags, mittens, socks, and hats are just a few ideas of items that could be felted. Needle felting is a technique used to add decoration to a knitted or felted piece where raw roving is applied using a very sharp barbed felting needle by repeatedly piercing the roving and background together. Once washed in hot water, the appliqued decoration is fused with the background. Felted knitting can be cut with scissors without concern about fraying. Yarn for hand knitting is usually sold as balls or skeins or hanks, although it may also be wound on spools or cones. Skeins and balls are generally sold with a yarn band, a label that describes the yarn's weight, length, dye lot, fiber content, washing instructions, suggested needle size, likely gauge, etc. It is common practice to save the yarn band for future reference, especially if additional skeins must be purchased. Knitters generally ensure that the yarn for a project comes from a single dye lot. The dye lot specifies a group of skeins that were dyed together and thus have precisely the same color. Skeins from different dye lots, even if they are similar in color, are usually slightly different and may produce a visible stripe when knitted together. If a knitter buys insufficient yarn of a single dye lot to complete a project, additional skeins of the same dye lot can sometimes be obtained from other yarn stores or online. Otherwise, knitters can alternate skeins every few rows to help the dye lots blend together easily. The thickness or weight of the yarn is a significant factor in determining the gauge, that is, how many stitches and rows are required to cover a given area for a given stitch pattern. Thicker yarns generally require thicker knitting needles, whereas thinner yarns may be knit with thick or thin needles. Hence, thicker yarns generally require fewer stitches and therefore less time to knit up a given garment. Patterns and motifs are coarser with thicker yarns. Thicker yarns produce bold visual effects, whereas thinner yarns are best for refined patterns. Yarns are grouped by thickness into 6 categories: superfine, fine, light, medium, bulky, and super bulky. Quantitatively, thickness is measured by the number of wraps per inch (WPI). The related weight per unit length is usually measured in tex or denier. Before knitting, the knitter will typically transform a hank into a ball where the yarn emerges from the center of the ball. This making the knitting easier by preventing the yarn from becoming easily tangled. This transformation may be done by hand or with a device known as a ball winder. When knitting, some knitters enclose their balls in jars to keep them clean and untangled with other yarns. The free yarn passes through a small hole in the jar lid. A yarn's usefulness for a knitting project is judged by several factors, such as its loft, which is its ability to trap air, its resilience, that is elasticity under tension, its washability and color fastness, its hand, that is its feel, particularly softness versus scratchiness, its durability against abrasion, its resistance to pilling, its hairiness or fuzziness, its tendency to twist or untwist, its overall weight and drape, its blocking and felting qualities, its comfort, that is breathability, moisture absorption, wicking properties, and of course its look, which includes its color, sheen, smoothness, and ornamental features. Other factors include allergenicity, speed of drying, resistance to chemicals, moths and mildew, melting point and flammability, retention of static electricity, and the propensity to become stained and to accept dyes. Different factors may be more significant than others for different knitting projects, so there is no one best yarn. The resilience and propensity to untwist are general properties that affect the ease of hand knitting. More resilient yarns are more forgiving of irregularities in tension. Highly twisted yarns are sometimes difficult to knit, whereas untwisting yarns can lead to split stitches in which not all of the yarn is knitted into a stitch. A key factor in knitting is stitch definition, corresponding to how well complicated stitch patterns can be seen when made from a given yarn. Smooth, highly spun yarns are best for showing off stitch patterns. At the other extreme, very fuzzy yarns or eyelash yarns have poor stitch definition and any complicated stitch pattern would be invisible. Although knitting may be done with ribbons, metal wire or more exotic filaments, most yarns are made by spinning fibers. In spinning, the fibers are twisted so that the yarn resists breaking under tension. The twisting may be done in either direction, resulting in a Z-twist or S-twist yarn. If the fibers are first aligned by combing them, the yarn is smoother and called a worsted. By contrast, if the fibers are carded but not combed, the yarn is fuzzier and called woolen spun. The fibers making up a yarn may be continuous filament fibers such as silk and many synthetics, or they may be staples, fibers of an average length, typically a few inches. Naturally, filament fibers are sometimes cut up into staples before spinning. The strength of the spun yarn against breaking is determined by the amount of twist, the length of the fibers, and the thickness of the yarn. In general, yarns become stronger with more twist, also called wurst, longer fibers and thicker yarns, that is more fibers. For example, thinner yarns require much more twist than do thicker yarns to resist breaking under tension. The thickness of the yarn may vary along its length. A slub is a much thicker section in which a mass of fibers is incorporated into the yarn. The spun fibers are generally divided into animal fibers, plant and synthetic fibers. These fiber types are chemically different, corresponding to proteins, carbohydrates and synthetic polymers respectively. Animal fibers include silk but generally are long hairs of animals such as sheep, goat, angora or cashmere goat, rabbit, angora, llama, alpaca, dog, cat, camel, yak and muskox, that is quivet. Plants used for fibers include cotton, flax for linen, bamboo, rami, hemp, jute, nettle, raffia, yucca, coconut husk, banana trees, soy and corn. Rayon and acetate fibers are also produced from cellulose, mainly derived from trees. Common synthetic fibers include acrylics, polyesters such as Dacron and Ingeo, nylon and other polyamides, and olefins such as polypropylene. Of these types, wool is generally favored for knitting, chiefly owing to its superior elasticity, warmth, and sometimes felting. However, wool is generally less convenient to clean and some people are allergic to it. It is also common to blend different fibers in the yarn. Example 85% alpaca and 15% silk. Even within a type of fiber, there can be great variety in the length and thickness of the fibers. For example, merino wool and Egyptian cotton are favored because they produce exceptionally long, thin, fine fibers for their type. A single spun yarn may be knitted as is or braided or piled with another. In plying, two or more yarns are spun together almost always in the opposite sense from which they were spun individually. For example, two Z-twist yarns are usually piled with an S-twist. The opposing twist relieves some of the yarn's tendency to curl up and produces a thicker balanced yarn. Piled yarns may themselves be piled together, producing cabled yarns or multi-stranded yarns. Sometimes the yarns being plied are fed at different rates so that one yarn loops around the other, as in boucle. The single yarns may be dyed separately before plying or afterwards to give the yarn a uniform look. The dyeing of yarns is a complex art. Yarns need not be dyed, or they may be dyed one color or a great variety of colors. Dyeing may be done industrially, by hand, or even hand painted into the yarn. A great variety of synthetic dyes have been developed since the synthesis of indigo dye in the mid-19th century. However, natural dyes are also possible, although they are generally less brilliant. The color scheme of a yarn is sometimes called its colorway. Variegated yarns can produce interesting visual effects, such as diagonal stripes. Conversely, a variegated yarn may frustrate an otherwise good knitting pattern by producing distasteful color combination. In very simple cases, knitting can be done without tools, using only the fingers to do these tasks. However, knitting is usually carried out using tools such as knitting needles, knitting machines, or rigid frames. Depending on their size and shape, the rigid frames are called knitting boards, knitting rings, also called knitting looms, or knitting spools, also known as knitting nobbies, knitting nancies, or crockers. There is also a technique of knitting with a crochet hook that has a cord attached to the end to hold the stitches while they are being worked. This technique is called nooking. Other tools are used to prepare yarn for knitting, to measure and design knitted garments, or to make knitting easier or more comfortable. There are three basic types of knitting needles, also called knitting pins. The first and most common type consists of two slender, straight sticks tapered to a point at one end and with a knob at the other end to prevent stitches from slipping off. Such needles are usually 10 to 16 inches, that is 250 to 410 millimeters long, but due to the compressibility of knitted fabrics, may be used to knit pieces significantly wider. The most important property of needles is their diameter, which ranges from below 2 to 25 millimeters, that is roughly 1 inch. The diameter affects the size of stitches, which affects the gauge of the knitting and the elasticity of the fabric. Thus, a very simple way to change gauge is to use different needles, which is the basis of uneven knitting. Although knitting needle diameter is often measured in millimeters, there are several different size systems, particularly those specific to the United States and the United Kingdom and Japan. A conversion table is given at knitting needle. Such knitting needles may be made out of any materials, but the most common materials are metals, wood, bamboo, and plastic. Different materials have different frictions and grip the yarn differently. Slick needles such as metallic needles are useful for swift knitting, whereas rougher needles such as bamboo offer more friction and are therefore less prone to dropping stitches. The knitting of new stitches occurs only at the tapered ends. Needles with lighted tips have been sold to allow knitters to knit in the dark. The second type of knitting needles are straight, double-pointed knitting needles, also called DPNs. Double-pointed needles are tapered at both ends, which allows them to be knit from either end. DPNs are typically used for circular knitting, especially smaller tube-shaped pieces such as sleeves, collars, and socks. Usually, one needle is active while the other holds the remaining active stitches. DPNs are somewhat shorter, typically 7 inches, and are usually sold in sets of 4 or 5. Cable needles are a special case of DPNs, although they usually are not straight but dimpled in the middle. Often they have the form of a hook. When cabling a knitted piece, a hook is easier to grab and hold the yarn. Cable needles are typically very short, a few inches, and are used to hold stitches temporarily while others are being knitted. Cable patterns are made by permuting the order of stitches. Although 1 or 2 stitches may be held by hand or knit out of order, cables of 3 or more generally require a cable needle. The third needle type consists of circular needles, which are long, flexible, double-pointed needles. The two tapered ends, typically 5 inches or 130 mm long, are rigid and straight, allowing for easy knitting. However, the two ends are connected by a flexible strand, usually nylon, that allows the two ends to be brought together. Circular needles are typically 24 to 60 inches long and are usually used singly or in pairs. Again, the width of the knitted piece may be significantly longer than the length of the circular needle. A developing trend in the knitting world is the interchangeable needles. These kits consist of pairs of needles with usually nylon cables or cords. The cables or cords are screwed into the needles, allowing the knitter to have both flexible straight needles or circular needles. This also allows the knitter to change the diameter and length of the needles as needed. The ability to work from either end of one needle is convenient in several types of knitting, such as slip stitch versions of double knitting. Circular needles may be used for flat or circular knitting. Cable needles are a specific design and are used to create the twisting motif of the knitted cable. They are made in different sizes, which produces cables of different widths. When in use, the cable needle is used at the same time as two regular needles. It functions by holding together the stitches creating the cable as the other needles create the rest of the stitches for the knitted piece. At specific points indicated by the pattern, the cable needle is moved. The stitches on it are worked by the other needles, then the cable needle is turned around to a different position to create the cable twist. Mega knitting needles are generally considered to be any knitting needles larger than the size 17, that is half inch diameter. Mega needles may or may not have hooks carved in the ends. Hooks on large diameter needles help enormously to control the stitches while knitting. The largest aluminium circular knitting needles on record are size US 150 and are nearly 7 feet tall. They are owned by Paradise Fibers and are currently on display in the Paradise Fibers. Record. The current record holder of the Guinness World Record for knitting with the largest knitting needles is Julia Hobson of Penzance in Cornwall. Julia knitted a square of 10 stitches and 10 rows in stockinette stitch using knitting needles that were 6.5 centimeters in diameter and 3.5 meters long. Various tools have been developed to make hand knitting easier. Tools for measuring needle diameter and yarn properties have been discussed above, as well as the yarn swift, ball winder and yarn tainers. Crochet hooks and a darning needle are often useful in binding off or in joining two knitted pieces edge to edge. The darning needle is used in duplicate stitch, also known as Swiss darning, while the crochet hook is essential for repairing dropped stitches and some specialty stitches such as tufting. Some ancillary tools used by hand knitters. Starting from the bottom right are 2 crochet hooks, 2 stitch holders or quasi-safety pins and 2 cable needles in pink and green. On the left are a pair of scissors, a yarn needle, green and blue stitch markers and 2 orange point protectors. At the top left are 2 blue point protectors, one on a red needle. Other tools that are used to prepare specific ornaments include the pom-pom tree for making pom-poms conveniently. For large or complex patterns, it is sometimes difficult to keep track of which stitch should be knit in a particular way. Therefore, several tools have been developed to identify the number of a particular row or stitch, including circular stitch markers, hanging markers, extra yarn and row counters. A second potential difficulty is that the knitted piece will slide off the tapered end of the needles when unattended. This is prevented by point protectors that cap the tapered ends. Another problem is that too much knitting may lead to hand and wrist troubles. For this, special stress-relieving gloves are available. Finally, there are sundry bags and containers for holding knitting yarns and needles. Industrially, metal wire is also knitted into a metal fabric for a wide range of uses, including the filter material in cafeterias, catalytic converters for cars, and many other uses. These fabrics are usually manufactured on circular knitting machines that would be recognized by conventional knitters as sock machines. Module 2: Knitting Techniques. The process of knitting has the following basic tasks. First, the active stitches must be held so they don't drop. Second, these stitches must be released sometime after they are secured. New brights of yarn must be passed through the fabric, usually through active stitches, thus securing them. There are many hundreds of different knitting stitches used by knitters. A piece of knitting begins with the process of casting on, also known as binding on, which involves the initial creation of the stitches on the needle. Different methods of casting on are used for different effects. One may be stretchy enough for lace, while another provides a decorative edging. Provisional cast-ons are used when the knitting will continue in both directions from the cast-on. There are various methods employed to cast on, such as the thumb method, also known as slingshot or long-tail cast-ons. Here, the stitches are created by a series of loops that will, when knitted, give a very loose edge ideal for picking up stitches and knitting a border. The double needle method, also known as knit-on or cable cast-on, whereby each loop placed on the needle is then knitted on, which produces a firmer edge ideal on its own as a border, and many more. The number of active stitches remains the same as when cast on unless stitches are added, an increase, or removed, that is a decrease. Most Western style knitters follow either the English style, in which the yarn is held in the right hand, or the continental style, in which the yarn is held in the left hand. There are also different ways to insert the needle into the stitch. Knitting through the front of a stitch is called Western knitting. Going through the back of a stitch is called Eastern knitting. A third method called combination knitting goes through the front of a knit stitch and the back of a purl stitch. Once the knitted piece is finished, the remaining live stitches are cast off. Casting or binding off loops the stitches across each other so that they can be removed from the needle without unraveling the item. Although the mechanics are different from casting on, there is a similar variety of methods. In knitting certain articles of clothing, especially larger ones like sweaters, the final knitted garment will be made of several knitted pieces with individual sections of the garment knit separately and then sewn together. Seamless knitting, where a whole garment is knit as a single piece, is also possible. Elizabeth Zimmermann is probably the best known proponent of seamless or circular knitting techniques. Smaller items such as socks and hats are usually knit in one piece on double-pointed needles or circular needles. Mega knitting is a term recently coined and relates to the use of knitting needles greater than or equal to half an inch in diameter. Mega knitting uses the same stitches and techniques as conventional knitting, except that hooks are carved into the ends of the needles. The hook needles greatly enhance control of the work, catching the stitches and preventing them from slipping off. The development of the knitting machine introduced hooked needles and enabled faultless automated knitting. Most knitters probably aren't even aware of many processes that their fingers perform in the making of a single stitch. However, large gauge needles emphasize those actions and knitting becomes increasingly more awkward when the needle diameter is greater than the width of the knitter's finger. On a 1-inch diameter size 50 needle, for instance, the shaft begins to taper 1 3/4 inches from the tip. This means that the stitches are spread much farther apart on mega knitting needles, making them more difficult to control. The hook catches the loop of yarn as each stitch is knitted, meaning that wrists and fingers don't have to work so hard and there is less chance of stitches slipping off the needle. The position of the hook is most important. Turn the left non-working hook to face away at all times. Turn the right working hook towards you up whilst knitting, plain stitch and away whilst purling. Mega knitting produces a chunky, bulky fabric or an open lacy weave depending on the weight and type of yarn used. Step 1. To make a starting loop, fold the yarn to make a loop. Catch the yarn through the loop. Step 2. Pull it through. Step 3. Pull the ends to tighten the slip knot. Now wind the yarn around your left hand as shown. Step 1. Make a loop on one of the needles. Hold this needle in your left hand. Step 2. Take the second needle in your right hand and put it through the loop. Put the yarn around. Step 3. Pull this loop through the first loop. Step 4. Put this new loop on your left needle. Step 5. Now push your needle between the two stitches. Put the yarn around. Step 6. Pull the loop through. Step 7. Put it on your left needle. Step 8. Make as many stitches as you need. Step 1. Push your needle through the first stitch. Step 2. Put the yarn round. Step 3. Pull the loop through. Step 4. Knit every stitch to the end of the row. Step 5. Change the needles over and knit another row. Step 6. Rows of knit stitch are called garter stitch. Step 1. With the yarn at the front, push the needle through the first loop towards you. Step 2. Put the yarn round. Step 3. Pull the yarn through. Step 4. Slip the stitch off the left hand needle. Step 5. Purl every stitch to the end of the row. Change the needles over and purl another row. Step 6. If you knit one row, then purl the next. You make stocking stitch. Step 7. If you knit one, purl one, right across, you make rib.
Hi everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how to do a basic knit one, purl one rib. This particular pattern is very popular and is used a lot of times in shaping, in making cuffs, or just some type of stretchable fabric. So once you learn this stitch, you will find that you actually use it a lot in your future projects. So the first thing you want to do is cast on the amount of stitches that the pattern calls for, or however many stitches that you feel like doing. If you're just working a gauge swatch or something like that, just cast on however many you'd like. and then you're going to begin the knit one, purl one ribbing, which is honestly exactly the way that it sounds. It basically means you're going to knit one stitch, purl the next, knit one stitch, and purl the next. So that is what we are going to do. Knit that first stitch, purl the next, knit the next stitch, purl the next, knit the next stitch, purl the next, and just continue on and on until you have finished the row, which I'm almost to here. It's like 100 degrees in here today, so everything's kind of sticking, which makes my life a lot more difficult. So when you're done with the row, you just turn it around, or if you're working in the round, you just keep going. But essentially what you're looking for on the next row is what happened on the row below. So you don't really need to follow a pattern and have it be row 1, knit 1, purl 1, row 2, purl 1, knit 1, stuff like that. All you have to do is look at the row below to figure out what you're doing, and it ends up being kind of mindless. So if we take a look at the row we just did, after we flipped, we see that it looks like this was knit, this has a bump on it, so that must be purl, this one's knit, purl, so you can kind of figure out what you're going to be doing. Now every column that has a knit stitch like this, that means this stitch is going to be knitted. Any column that has a bump means that that stitch is going to be purled. So here where it looks like we have a knit on the row below, we're just going to knit that. Then here we have a bump, which means that this stitch is going to be purled. There we have a knit stitch, so knit, bump, purl. And then since it's alternating anyway, you don't have to look for every single stitch, but that just kind of helps you get going in the rhythm. As long as you can tell what the first 2 stitches are, you can be fairly certain the rest of it's going to work out evenly. And then just knit to the end of the row. And there you can even start to see it forming a little bit, where you have your purls in the middle and your column of knit stitches there. And then your next row, it's pretty much rinse, repeat. So here we see that this column looks like it's knit, and the second column has bumps, so that means that it's purled. So that means that this stitch you're going to knit, and this one you're going to purl. And then since it's alternating every other, then you just automatically continue moving along in that fashion. And it really is the same whether or not you're working back and forth or in the round, because you just have to pay attention to what's going on in the row below. And once you figure out how to do that, you don't really need to follow a pattern. Most patterns anyway will say, do knit 1, purl 1 ribbing for 3 inches or something like that, instead of writing out the pattern for however many rows that they think that you'll need. So there we have another row completed, and I'll do this one more time just so if you're knitting along with me, you can see what you're doing. So again, this column looks like it's knit, so that means this stitch is going to be knit. This column has bumps, so that means it's going to be purled. And then just continue across. And it's very simple. It's just your 2 basic stitches, and once you get going along, it just becomes very easy. So you're just going to continue that way for as long as the pattern calls for, or as long as you'd like. Okay, so here I've done a few more rows and kind of finished my swatch just so you can get an idea of what it looks like. So here you can see it's all columns of knits here and all columns of purls here, and it's reversible, and it's also very stretchy. So that's why it's used a lot of times for things like cuffs and shaping and things like that, because it does help things fit nicely. So that's all I have to show you today. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will try to answer them quickly and help you out if I can. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and have a great day. Bye!
Now you have learned knit and purl stitches. You can make many patterns. 2 useful ones are shown here. Step 1. Knit 2 stitches. Step 2. Pick up the first stitch and lift it over the second stitch. Step 3. Drop it off the needle. Step 4. Knit one more stitch to make 2 on your needle. Lift the first stitch over as you did before. Carry on like this until there is only one stitch left. Step 5. Break the end and put it through the stitch. Slip the stitch off the needle and pull the end tight. Step 1. To increase is to make one stitch. Knit the stitch as usual, but do not slip it off the needle. Now knit into the back of the same stitch. Step 2. This time slip the stitch off the needle. You have made 2 stitches out of 1. Step 3. To decrease is to lose one stitch. Put your needle through 2 stitches. Step 4. Slip the 2 stitches off the left needle. You have now lost a stitch. Step 1. If you drop a stitch, turn your knitting so that the loop is in the front of the strand. Step 2. With a hook, pick up the strand and pull it through the loop. Step 3. Pick up the next strand through the new loop and pull it through. Do this until you reach the row that you are knitting. Put the loop back on the needle. Step 1. When you have to join your yarn, always join at the end of a row and knot them together. To cast on, you start with a slip knot. This serves as your first stitch. When made correctly, it is easy to adjust its size. Pull on the loop and it gets bigger. Pull on the tail to tighten. If your knot does not do this, follow the root of the yarn as shown in the diagram carefully when making it again. Now you have one stitch on your left hand needle and are ready to make another. Insert the right hand needle into the stitch loop and lay the yarn across. To control the yarn, hold it as shown, over the forefinger, under the middle finger, over the last finger, and then loop it around the little finger. This is something that needs a little perseverance but helps feed the yarn evenly and therefore gives an even tension, and later will help you to knit more quickly. Pull a new loop through the first loop and then slide it onto the left hand needle. You now have 2 stitches on the left hand needle. All the rest of the stitches are made the same way, so carry on until you feel comfortable. Don't worry if your stitches are slightly different sizes. Even tension comes with a little practice. So if a pattern tells you to cast on 30 stitches, you will make your slip knot counting as stitch 1 and then make a series of 29 new stitches making 30 in all. This is made on one needle. Make a slip knot and slide it on, ensuring you have a long tail. Wrap yarn from long tail over your thumb and onto needle. Using yarn from ball, knit the loop to turn it into a stitch, sliding your thumb out as you do so. Repeat for number of stitches required. To cast off, knit the first 2 stitches so that they are now both on the right hand needle. Put the tip of the left hand needle into the first stitch you knitted. Lift it over the top of your second stitch and let it come off the tip of the needle. It will now be around the neck of your second knitted stitch. Knit the next stitch and repeat. You will always lift the stitch farthest away from the tip of the right hand needle over the last stitch that you knitted. Repeat all the way along the row until one stitch remains. Break off the yarn and pull the stitch loop until the end comes through, fastening off the last stitch securely. This means the same as INC1, that is increase one stitch. There are several ways of increasing, but the one which is generally written as M1 can be done like this. Knit row. Pick up the strand between the two needles using left needles. Knit or K into the back of the picked up loop, thus forming a new stitch. Slip on to the right hand needle. Purl row. As shown for K row, then P into the back of the new stitch. Slip on to the right hand needle. If you have tried out the first casting on method, then you have already started plain knitting. Holding the needle which has the stitches in your left hand and the empty needle with your right, insert the tip of the right hand needle into the first stitch nearest the needle point. Hold the yarn as done for easy cast on. Wind the yarn over the needle. Pull a new loop through. Now slip the new stitch onto the right hand needle. You have now knitted a stitch and should work in the same manner until the left hand needle is empty and the right hand needle holds a new set of stitches. Swap hands so that the needle with stitches is in your left hand and you can start another new row. Stitches which knit into the front of the old stitch are known as knit K stitches. Purl stitches are made with the yarn to the front of the work. Insert the right hand needle into the stitch through the part of the loop which is nearest to you from front to back. Take the yarn round the needle and through to the front. Pull the new loop through and pull it off the top of the left needle. Work a mattress stitch seam by placing pieces right sides facing and edge to edge. Using a wool sewing needle, join thread to one piece and then take a small straight stitch in the second piece. Take the needle back to the same position as it came out of piece 1 and make another straight stitch in the piece 1. Work back and forth as illustrated, pulling the thread up regularly to close the gap between the pieces. This seam enables edges and patterns to be matched very precisely and is reasonably flat, retains elasticity and won't give bulky seams. Occasionally, designers will give specific instructions as to seam and joining methods which should be used. Whenever possible, follow their advice as they have selected the best method for the particular item. This is a method of decreasing a stitch. Put the tip of right hand needle through the two stitches at the tip of the left hand needle. Now knit one stitch. Knit 3 stitches together as shown, but read 3 for 2. To join a new ball or a new color, example for stripes, leave tails approximately 8 to 10 centimeters and loosely tie the old ball and new one together at the edge of the row. When knitting is complete, untie the knots, thread yarns through a tapestry needle and weave them back into the reverse of the work. Now that you have learned how to knit and purl, you can finally put them together to make stockinette stitch, the V-patterned fabric that people most often associate with knitting. Unlike garter stitch, which appears ridged and does not roll, stockinette stitch has a much smoother appearance and a tendency to curl at the edges. Many designers use this inclination to their advantage, creating everything from rolled necks and cuffs to rolled edges of handbags and scarves. Row 1. Knit all stitches. Row 2. Purl all stitches. Repeat. This is the simple knit stitch. The next photo shows what it looks like on the reverse or the purl side. Because it is different on each side and does not lie flat, it is not the best choice in knit scarf patterns or blankets but is commonly used for clothing. Row 1. Knit all stitches. Row 2. knit all stitches. Repeat. This is a great stitch for learning how to knit because it is continuous knit stitch on both sides, that is no purl stitch. It looks the same on both sides, so can be used to knit a scarf or blanket. This is the most basic of all stitch patterns and is achieved by knitting every row. The end result is a flat, reversible, ridged fabric that stands up well to wear and does not roll at the edges. Here is how to do it. When you get to the end of your first row of knit stitches, transfer the full needle to your left hand and start the process of knitting each stitch all over again. After several rows, you will begin to see the fruits of your labor, and in time your growing strip of garter stitch will start to look like a real piece of knitted fabric. Alternating entire rows of knit and purl stitches creates the well-known stockinette stitch, but it is also possible to switch back and forth within the same row to produce numerous different patterns. Of all the knit or purl stitch patterns you will learn, ribbing is definitely the most widely used. Because of its stretchiness and ability to bounce back into place, ribbing makes up the hems, necks and cuffs of most sweaters. Many sweaters even use ribbing throughout the garment to create a slim, body-hugging effect. One of the nice things about ribbing, besides its elasticity, is that after the first row or two, you can put down the instructions and let the stitches show you what comes next. When the stitch you are about to work looks like a V, knit it. When it looks like a bump, purl it. The trickiest part about ribbing for beginners is remembering to move the yarn back and forth when working the different stitches. For example, in 2x2 ribbing, you knit 2 stitches, move the yarn between the 2 needles to the front of the work and then purl 2 stitches. When you are ready to knit again, return the yarn to the back of the work by passing it between the 2 needles, then continue with your pattern. If you don't move the yarn from back to front and front to back between knit and purl stitches, you will end up with extra stitches on your needle and a rectangular piece that quickly begins to resemble a triangle. When knitting a stitch, the yarn is always held at the back of the work. When purling a stitch, the yarn is always at the front. In ribbing, when you change from a knit to a purl stitch, you must be sure the yarn is in the correct position to work the next stitch. When you are moving the yarn from the back to the front or vice versa, the yarn should go between the 2 needles, not over them. Row 1. Knit 1, purl 1 across. Row 2. Knit into knitted stitches, purl into purled stitches. Repeat. This will look the same on both sides and will lie flat, so great for scarves and blankets as well as sweaters, collars, cuffs and hats. Row 1. Knit 2, purl 2. Row 2. Knit into knit stitches, purl into purl stitches. Repeat. This is probably the most common of the rib knits. Like the rib stitch above, it looks the same on both sides. It has good stretch, so is often used for sweater cuffs and hats as well as scarves. There are more variations such as knit 2, purl 1, knit 3, purl 3, knit 3, purl 2 and so on. Row 1. Knit 1, purl 1. Row 2. Knit into purl stitches, purl into knit stitches, opposite of rib stitch. Repeat. This stitch looks the same on both sides and lies flat, so can be used well with knit scarf patterns and blankets. It does not have the stretch of the rib stitches though. Seed stitch is a textured stitch created by working a sequence of knit and purl stitches, usually alternated on every row. Unlike ribbing, you knit the purl stitches and purl the knit stitches. Cast on an even number of stitches. Row 1, right side, knit 1, purl 1, repeat from start to end. Row 2, purl 1, knit 1, repeat from start to end. Repeat rows 1 and 2. Cast on an even number of stitches. Row 1, right side, knit 1, purl 1, repeat from start to end. Row 2, repeat row 1. Row 3, purl 1, knit 1, repeat from start to end. Row 4, repeat row 3. Repeat rows 1 through 4. Step 1. Hold needle with stitches in left hand. Insert point of right needle in first stitch from front to back just as in casting on. Step 2. With right index finger, bring yarn from ball under and over point of right needle. Step 3. Draw yarn through stitch with right needle point. Step 4. This step now differs from casting on. Slip loop on left needle off, so new stitch is entirely on right needle. This completes one knit stitch. Repeat steps 1 through 4 in each stitch, still on left needle. When the last stitch is worked, one row of knitting is completed. Now measure your work. It should be about 7 inches wide. If it is too wide, start over and cast on fewer stitches. If it is too narrow, start over and cast on more stitches. When the width is correct, begin next knit row as follows. Turn right needle and hold it now in left hand. With free needle in right hand, work steps 1 through 4 of first knit row in each stitch. Again, take needle with stitches in left hand and work another row of knit stitches. Work rows of knit stitches until block measures 9 inches long. To complete the block, now bind off all the stitches. Step 1. Knit the first 2 stitches. Insert left needle into stitch you knitted first and pull it over the second stitch and completely off the needle. One stitch is now bound off. Step 2. Knit one more stitch, insert left needle into the first stitch on right needle and pull it over the new stitch and completely off the needle. Another stitch is bound off. Don't work too tightly. Repeat step 2 until one stitch remains. Now cut yarn from skein, leaving a 6-inch end. With needle, draw end up and through last stitch to secure it. Thread yarn end into yarn needle and weave end into several stitches to secure it.
Hi, welcome to Knitting Help. My name is Amy Finley and it's my pleasure to teach you how to knit today. I'm just going to do a small demo project, a little rectangle, which will have all of the steps that you need, whether you want to knit a scarf, a felted purse, or pot holder, felted pot holder or coaster. Just cast on. If you're doing a felted project, make sure you choose 100% wool, non-washable, non-machine washable yarn. So to begin, knitting begins with a cast on. I like to teach long tail cast on. Knitting on is another method you might like. You can find other methods, a whole host of methods for cast on and other stitch techniques on our website, knittinghelp.com, or on our app, the Knitting Help knitting app. So long tail cast on. For long tail you need a long tail. I like to leave about a foot of yarn for 20 stitches. It can vary depending on how tightly you do it, so maybe give a little extra. So I'm just going to do a little project here. So I dangle the tail over my thumb and the working yarn over my index finger, grasp them, and insert the needle to begin. And actually, I'm just going to point out, I'm using a circular needle. You can use straight needle or whatever for a flat rectangular project like we're doing. But you can also use a circular needle, which I tend to prefer. And if you're going to buy one pair of needles, get a circular, and then you can do a hat as your next project, like a 16-inch circular. Or these needles are the ones we sell, the Denise interchangeable needles. And they come in different, you can attach different cable lengths for different size projects. So I'm actually going to pop this off and just cast on a single needle so it's not rattling about. Okay, so tail over the thumb and working yarn over the index finger, grasp them. Now insert your needle into the strand at the top between the thumb and index finger and just pull down to begin. So now for long tail, cast on, go up into that thumb stitch. Notice I jumped over this working yarn. I didn't duck under it. Over the working yarn and up into the thumb loop, then over the index finger yarn. You're grabbing it and pulling it through the thumb loop here. Release the thumb from the loop, and then you can use the thumb to help tighten this whole thing up. So just ducking under the yarn to begin gave me that first stitch on the needle, and I've just done one cast on stitch to make two. So pull down again, and we are in our repeated pattern here. Just again over this yarn, then duck under the thumb loop, over the index finger, pull it through, release and tighten. So we're going to cast on however many stitches you need for your project. You might do 30 stitches, for instance, for a small felted project or a scarf. And I'm just using worsted weight yarn, kind of a heavy worsted weight in this case, which means you might use a bulky yarn if you want a really fast project as a beginner. A worsted weight yarn is a certain thickness. A bulky weight is thicker. Worsted weight yarns usually will say on the yarn label 7 or 8, US size 7 or 8 needles, which is, I believe, 4.5 or 5 millimeter for European knitters. Okay, so we've got a few stitches here. I'm going to pop my needle back on, my cable. Okay, so we've cast on the stitches on my right hand. I'm now going to switch that needle into my left hand and grab the empty needle in my right hand to begin knitting. And I like to line up the cast on edge to the right. It positions it well to get it into the stitch. So to knit the first stitch, I guess I'll just leave this yarn dangling, but if you want to, you can knit it along with the working yarn as if they were one strand for a few stitches, and then that will weave it in so you can cut it off. I'm just going to leave it so it doesn't confuse things. So you can see what we're doing here. Okay, so up, I'm bringing the needle up into the first stitch, putting it behind the shaft of the left-hand needle. We're doing the knit stitch. Knitting consists of knit stitches and purl stitches. So the basic knit stitch, just wrapping this yarn between the two needles, sort of in a counterclockwise direction if I'm looking down on the needles. and then pulling that strand through the stitch. This is sort of tricky. Tends to help to angle the needle down a little bit. And then we're sliding this stitch we've just worked into off of the left needle. And that's our first knit stitch. Do it again, a little bit closer. So up into this strand, getting the needle behind the shaft of the left needle, wrapping around, peeking through, and off jumps the old stitch. So I'm doing English knitting right now, which is the most common. It's also known as American knitting, actually, most commonly called English knitting, where I'm holding the yarn in the right hand and I have to somehow really get that yarn between the two needles to work the stitch. And now I'm going to show you what it looks like in the other hand, which is the way I currently knit, and I'll do most of this video in this hand because it's how I naturally hold it. At some point you'll want to develop a yarn holding tensioning system, I guess, so that you're not letting go of the yarn, picking it up every time. No rush, but it's easier for continental knitters if you do it first thing. I like to duck behind the yarn with my pinky, wrap it around once, and then duck my index finger under the strand. And that is just a way of holding the yarn that will feed the yarn to my knitting at a convenient tension and won't be hopefully too tight or too loose that I lose control. Okay, so having a yarn hold that comes up where the yarn ends by coming over my index finger is kind of the key thing with continental knitting. So now again, I'm just doing the same thing really. I'm going up into that stitch behind the shaft of this needle. And this time, instead of having to bring the yarn up between the needles, I'm just going to take this, I'm just doing what's called picking. I'm picking the yarn with this right needle and pulling it through the loop, pulling it through the stitch and off the needle. Again, up into the stitch, behind the working yarn, and somehow fetching it through. There's lots of ways of doing this. You'll find a natural rhythm here. My typical way employs my middle finger. I'm just going up into the stitch, and then I sort of swipe around my middle finger to fetch that yarn through. So whatever works for you. So that's the knit stitch. So play around with this. You can do as many rows of knitting as you like. If a felted project is kind of nice in that you can fiddle back and forth, knit stitch here, purl stitch there, do any kind of thing you want, and in the end you won't really see the pattern of the stitch pattern all that much, or any mistakes for that matter. So with our 100% wool yarn, we could do that. 100% wool or alpaca wool felt too. Okay, so now I'm switching that needle to my left hand and grabbing the empty right hand needle again, orienting my stitches to the right to get into that stitch more easily. And now I can begin knitting the next row. And as I begin the next row, I just want to make one tip, which is that the first stitch on your row, on your knitting, is going to want to be very loose and sloppy. That's just how it is in knitting. The end stitches will be raggedy and longer, and you'll go, what am I doing wrong? So to avoid that, you can either intentionally work very tightly that first stitch, or a common thing to do is just what's called slipping the first stitch of the row. And I'll show you what that is. Here, I'm just going to go into the stitch and just slide it off without knitting it. I've slipped the first stitch. Okay, so now knitting into the next stitch. Okay, so either English style, and I'll show you that same yarn hold, that tensioning hold in English. Come under with the pinky, wrap around, duck under with the index finger, and you have a nice carrying technique for the yarn in your right hand. And if you're a much more clever English knitter than I, you can do it without letting go of the right needle if you like. Something like that. Okay, and again in the left hand, continental. These are creating the same stitches. Feel free to play around back and forth. It's not going to affect any knitting project, whether you're switching continental. Really all you're doing is coming into the front of the stitch to pull your loop through and that's the knit stitch. And if you end up somehow wrapping the yarn the other way around, it'll twist it so that the front loop is on the left side a bit, and that's not what we want to do. But otherwise, as long as you're fetching from the front of the knitting, grabbing that yarn from the front and pulling it through, then that's the knit stitch, and really however you want to do it is fine. Okay, so now let's talk about the purl stitch. The purl stitch is reaching into the stitch from the back of the knitting and pulling a strand through. And so to do it from the back of the knitting, you want to go down into that same loop. And I'll slip that first stitch for consistency. What the heck? Okay, so down into this first stitch, and now I'm showing you continental purling first because the strand is in my left hand. I'll just let you know right now that it's harder. People find it typically harder to get the knack for, and that's the one, if there's a downside to continental, it takes a little more dexterity and it doesn't work for everybody. So here we go. Let's try the purl stitch continental, and I'll show you the easier English way. Down into that stitch, and then however you want to approach getting this yarn, pushing it down between the needles to facilitate basically pushing that strand back out of the stitch, through the stitch that's on this needle. And then off jumps the old stitch, and we've done a purl. So again, get a little closer, see what I'm doing. So down into that strand, putting the yarn over the front of the needle, and then somehow getting it through this loop. And I'll show you a few ways continental knitters might manage it. I've seen people go like this to kind of grab the loop or grab the yarn, and then, I don't really do it. Let's see if I can do it. Maybe I'll use my thumb to help hold it in place. And then push it through the stitch. So down into the stitch. What I don't want, or what I want you to be aware of, if you're going to choose to do, but I don't recommend it per se, is the easy way of getting this yarn through the stitch continental style is actually simply getting your needle over it that way, and then it easily pops through. But then you've got your stitch in a different orientation than is commonly used. So again, here's the front loop on the needle is on the left side if you stretch it out relative to the back loop. And that's what I'll just call a twisted stitch. I'll leave that on the needle so we can come to it later and see what it looks like. Okay, so that's continental knitting or purling. And now I'll show you English purling, which is easier to manipulate. However, it is in one respect slower, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. So, you know, they've all got both methods have their pros and cons and followers. Okay, so the thing I may not have pointed out, and I'm going to point out very clearly now, is the working yarn needs to be in the front of the knitting when you're doing the purl stitch, and it needs to be in the back of the knitting when you're doing the knit stitch. I think we sort of just started out that way at the beginning of the row, and hopefully you followed along. But here in the middle of a row, it's more evident. So anyway, here we go. So in the front of the knitting, I'm going down into the stitch. I'm going to go in a counterclockwise manner if I'm looking down on the needle to wrap the yarn and push it back through. See how easy that was? We do like our easy English knitting. Wrap it, pop it through. So knitting is really just pulling a loop through another loop in various ways, however you manage it. So yeah, here we go. I'll just do a few more of these. We've done a purl row. And the stitches will be the same, again, whether you've done them continental or English, unless you did that one combined stitch, combined purling stitch, which oriented the stitch differently. Did I leave it on there? I thought I did. Oh, there it is. I believe. Okay. It's more evident when we come to it. Okay. I'm going to do a row with both knit and purl stitches, and you can see what's going on when you switch between knit and purl stitches. So the working yarn's behind the knitting. I'm going to do a knit stitch up into the stitch, throw the yarn, as they call it, fetch it through. And now for English knitters, well, for either, we need to get this yarn to the front, and for English knitters it looks like this. You manually bring it to the front before doing the purl stitch. So down into the stitch, counterclockwise wrap, pull it through and off. And now to go back to a knit stitch, you manually bring it to the back, go up into that stitch to knit, throw the yarn, fetch it through. So it's a back and forth motion, forward to do the purl stitch. Okay, and now for back to do the knit stitch, I'm going to switch to continental, and you can see the difference here. You get to see the difference between, this is sort of the perk of continental knitting. Watch this. So, oh, here's this funny twisted stitch. I'm actually going to knit. What you always want to do for knitting, I guess I'm backing up to address this, is you want to knit into the leading edge of the stitch, the first one you come to. In this case, it's in the back. So I'm going to go into that loop from the front of the knitting and grab the yarn and pull it through, and that creates a knit stitch that doesn't twist this stitch in any way. So we did knit one, and now watch what it looks like to jump from this knit stitch orientation with the yarn in the back to the purl stitch orientation with the yarn in the front. For continental knitting, it looks like this, where you just hop over the needle, and in fact, you'll see, it's not even a separate step. As you're doing the stitches, it can be done sort of in tandem. So with the knitting, with the working yarn in front, I'm just going to make sure I go behind that working yarn and down into the stitch on the left needle to do the purl stitch. And again, however you can do it, pop it through. You want the leading or the right hand edge to be on the right side of the stitch for a standard stitch orientation. So, you see I did it automatically. The yarn is automatically in the back. So here's the knit stitch with the yarn in the back. And then as I hop off, I'm just bringing it to the front to do the purl stitch. And then bring it off into the back to do the knit stitch. So there's no separate step of bringing the yarn forward or back with continental knitting and purling. So here I've done it. Here's what a row of alternate knit and purls looks like. You see the knit stitches on the needle. The stitch that's on the needle, if that's the head, like a person's head, if you think of that loop as a person's head, kind of looks, the stitch we just knitted looks like they're wearing a scarf or a shawl over their shoulders from the front. And that's a knit stitch. And then the purl stitch looks like the back of their head wearing that scarf. And that's exactly what it is. It's the back of, if I'm going to turn this one over, we'll look at it from the front. Same stitch. Looks like the front, the knit stitch on the other side, or the bumpy purl stitch on this side. It's the same stitch, it's just reversed. And if I continued to do knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, purling into these back of the scarf purl stitches and knitting into the front of the scarf knit stitches. Then we'll have a column of knit and a column of purl. Ribbing is usually done over an even number of stitches, what I'm doing now. Knit one, purl one, or knit two, purl two, where you stack these columns. Doesn't have to be, but it's easier to remember where you're at. So that's the beginning of ribbing. If I stagger them every other row, it's called seed stitch. And it looks like this. So this is my knit, this is my purl column, knit, purl. So for seed stitch, instead of knitting the knit column, I'll purl it on the next row. Or I could slip it, whatever. Just because it's the first stitch. Knit one, or purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl into those front of the scarf knit stitches, knit into the back of the scarf stitches. But you see how that's got kind of a neat bumpy, scattered bump effect. Whereas this has a column of a vertical element, that ribbing. So those are a couple stitch patterns. The most common stitch pattern most knitters begin with when they're doing their first scarf is just knitting every row, no purl stitches at all, and that produces what's called garter stitch, and I'll show you that. It's the easiest way to get a fabric that lays flat, I guess I'll just say. Makes for a good scarf, and it's easy to do. I do encourage playing around with the purl stitch as soon as you're comfortable doing so, just because it may determine which knitting method you choose to rely on as your main method, whether you're English or continental. I'm covering both in this video intentionally so that you can be oriented and decide, you know, as soon as you like which to do. And it's also good to practice both, I'll say right away, because at least with the knit stitch, a lot of people will ultimately employ both techniques, the holding in the right hand or the left hand the yarn. Continental or English style knitting can be employed at the same time when you're working with 2 strands of yarn, doing color work, and that's an exciting topic. And that's, you can learn about how to do color work in our advanced techniques section of Knitting Help. Okay, here's garter stitch. It's got a horizontal element to the knitting. It's got ridges, like we just did a knit row. So we've got those scarves hanging over the shoulders, but then on the back, we've got these ridges, the back of the scarf. Because we're turning the work every row, we're getting them on both sides, and it creates these ridges on both sides. That's garter stitch. And you're all probably wondering how to make that sort of familiar common knit fabric called stockinette stitch. And here's what we're doing now to do that. I just knitted a row. My last row was knitted for garter stitch, and now I'm purling a row. Purl, purl, purl the whole row across. And now I'm going to knit a row. Knit, knit, knit. I'm alternating a knit row and a purl row. A knit row and a purl row. And that's going to give me stockinette stitch or stocking stitch. I'll show you what that looks like. And here's that very familiar. It looks like all of the front of the scarf hanging on the person's shoulders, or V's, on top of V's, next to V's. It looks like that on one side, and on the back, it looks like all ridges or back of the head of wearing the scarf. So it looks like purl stitches on one side, and this is indeed the row we will purl when we're making stockinette fabric. We will, when this side is facing us, we will purl all of these stitches that are purling, that look like recently purled stitches. And when we're on the front of the work, we will knit all of those stitches facing us, looking like knit stitches. So that is, I think, it's a lot of information, but it's the basics for any beginner knitter. How to cast on, as we did, long tail cast on to begin. How to keep your edges neat, and how to do the knit stitch and the purl stitch in both continental and English styles. So the last couple tips I want to mention are when we're knitting along, say you're knitting your project, you're in the middle of a row and you have to stop for some reason and put down your knitting. I just want you to notice that the yarn right now, I just knit the stitch, is connected and attached more clearly to the right needle. If you tug on it, you can see it's tightening the loop on this right needle. So just notice that, because when you go to put down your knitting and you go to pick it up again, you might accidentally pick it up and go, okay, which side, where was I? Was I knitting this way or that way? Which hand do I hold the yarn in? So if you pick it up the wrong way, like this, and the yarn is attached in the left needle, and you grab that to begin knitting, you'll be knitting in the opposite direction you just came from. I'll do it to show you. And then if you continue on, you'll have a nice hole where there's that gap. So sometimes knitters go, how did I get this hole in my knitting? That's how. So don't do that. So when you stop your work and you drop it and you pick it up, just remember, look which needle is the yarn attached to, and put that in your right hand to begin your work. Actually, I'm going to back these up. And what the heck, I'll show you. I'm going to take my knitting off the needles, because I know that's the biggest fear of a lot of you. What do I do? Ready? So I'm going to slide these mistaken stitches right off. Unravel. Boop, 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 boop. All the way. Okay, I'll just do all of these. Basically, I'm unraveling it until it's attached and can't unravel anymore. And then I know where I'm at. I've got the yarn is attached to this needle, and this is going to be the needle in my right hand when I start knitting again. But let's get these loops back on this needle. I just come in from the back of the loop and poke it through each loop. And if the yarn is very twisty and wants to be coming and you want to come in from the front to make it easier, you can. Just remember to knit that leading edge of the stitch when you continue. Okay, so I've got the yarn attached to my right needle, and I'll just finish this row. Okay, so to bind off, here we go. We're going to finish our knitting in this little sample. So knitting this first stitch, I'm going to knit it, not slip it, for a nice square edge. Knit the second stitch, so I have 2 stitches on the right needle. And we're going to bind off the whole row now. So what I want to do is reach over this second stitch with this left needle and hook under the first stitch, and then I'm pulling it over the second stitch and off the needle. I just bound off my first stitch, and I have 1 on the right needle, so I'll knit another one and do it the same. Reach over the first, or reach over to grab the further stitch and pull it over the closer stitch to the left needle. Okay, knitting 1 and then binding off the previous stitch. And if I want to, I can also do this in purl. So to stay in pattern when binding off, say this was a recently purled stitch, not the knit stitch that's showing, but if I wanted to stay in pattern, I could purl it and bind it off. So you can bind off in either knit or purl. I'll go back to knit. And do the English knitters. Okay, I'm going to do this for the English knitters in my right hand. So let's say knit 1, And again, still using the left needle to bind it off. And if I want to do a purl stitch, one, I can bring it to the front, purl, and then just going from 2 stitches down to 1 by pulling that off. Okay, and one more purl stitch I'll do. Okay, and then I'm just going to break the yarn or cut it. This is a single ply yarn, so I just untwist it a little bit and it pulls right apart. I don't even need my scissors. There's 1 loop now on the knitting, and I can just fetch that broken strand right through it, feed it right through and pull to keep it from unraveling. And then, now the last thing I want to show you is called weaving in the end, or weaving in the ends, since we have 2 of them. And what we do is, this is a tapestry needle, a yarn needle. So I'm just threading this on the needle. So depending on the sample and what you're doing with it, you can do a couple of things to weave in your ends. If you're doing a scarf, you want it to, there's no back of the knitting per se in a scarf, so you'll probably want to do it in the most discreet way possible, and that would usually be duplicate stitch. So I'm going to go down 2 rows just to make it a little more easy for you to see. So I'm just hopping down a little bit, and what I'm going to do is copy the path of a single strand of yarn along the row of the knitting. And this might be easier to do with a blunt tip needle if you really want to duplicate and not split into another stitch by accident. You can use a blunt tip needle, but I think for our purposes it really doesn't matter. So I'm going to go through these 2. And if you find it hard to see what a single path of a single row looks like, and you want better clarity on that, try knitting in a multicolored yarn, because you'll see several stitches in a row of one color, and then on the next row several stitches of another color, and you can really see which is one row and which is another. But so I've done, here's one, here's another, and now here's the next one. So I could do a few stitches like this. Oh, I lost my yarn. And then maybe just pop it for the final, right before I cut. I like to, and this is great with a sharp needle, kind of go down into the middle of a ply, like into one side of a stitch, and then straight down into the next one below it. You could even do a few. Kind of try to get in bulk of the middle of the stitch. I shouldn't have hopped from the top of that because it kind of split it in an obvious way, but I wanted to show you what I was doing. Maybe hopping into the top of the stitch below where I was working would have been a little less obvious. Just kind of split that ply a little bit. That's okay. So now we can cut this off. Can cut it really close and it'll just sort of disappear into those plies. So that's duplicate stitch weaving in the ends. And now for had I knit those few stitches with the cast on, I could just cut it off, or maybe duck it up, maybe go up into one side of a few stitches like I just did before cutting off if I wanted to. But I'll show you one more technique for weaving in the ends, and this is when you have the back of a work like a sweater or something. It's a little faster. It's maybe more. It's a little more secure because you're using more yarn. So say this is the back of the knitting facing us right here. What I'll do is go skim vertically into the knitting just like I did, and it doesn't have to be neat as long as it's not showing through on the other side. Just skimming and splitting the plies. I need a sharp needle to do this. And then splitting the plies on, again going down the other direction. And I'm going up and down, not back and forth. I can skim purl nubs or knit. Whatever's convenient. So I usually do like an N shape, so once up, down, and then up again, or basically 3 passes, and then you can cut it. And you can leave a little bit hanging off if you want to ensure that it doesn't pop through the other side. You could even leave a little more than this if there is in fact a back of the knitting, and you don't have to worry about having a little dangly bit there. So that's it. Those are all the steps that you need to know in order to work on your first project. And to choose your first project, you know, whatever inspires you. For the one warning, the one thing I'd like to mention about your first scarf is to not do stockinette fabric, this very smooth, to not do only stockinette fabric, because that fabric tends to curl in at the sides. If you make a whole long rectangle of it, the sides will roll into a tube, like literally, and very little you can do to keep that from happening. So garter stitch is a great first scarf pattern. Ribbing or seed stitch also work great. They'll lay flat. So choose whichever you like for that. And if you do a felted project, the way to felt is to simply put your knitting sample into a protected cover like a pillowcase, ideally a zippered pillowcase, because it will want to come out of your regular pillowcase even if you knot it. Maybe a bunch of safety pins might keep it in if you close it up with that. But some kind of protective cover, and then throw that in your washing machine with some other clothes to rub up against it and rub and agitate it. If you have a top loader machine, it should go pretty quickly. Check on it every 3 to 5 minutes to see how felted it's getting. And you can, with a front loader machine, it can take a while. I recommend just doing it on a laundry day when you're doing a bunch of loads anyway. Make sure it's in a zippered case so that it's not collecting lint from all of your laundry or putting lint on it. And then just, you know, run several cycles probably in a front loader. And if you want it to be a square final product, make it about 15 to 20% taller, because it shrinks more vertically when it's felted. And that's it. Enjoy your first project. I hope this overview has been exciting and helpful for you.
Hi, and welcome to this knitting tutorial brought to you by allfreeknitting.com. Today's video lesson is on how to knit using the continental method. What I have right here are yarn and knitting needles. I'm using a size 10.5. The weight of the yarn is worsted weight. And I've already done 15 stitches and knit into every row back and forth. And this pattern is called the garter stitch when you knit every row. Before you start knitting, I'd like to show you that if you keep your yarn to the back of your needle, that's the correct position you need to have it before you start knitting. If the yarn is twisted up and over, you'll get an extra loop right here. If you knit into that, you'll have an extra stitch on your needles, and that will throw your pattern off. So be certain before you start knitting that your yarn is pulled under and to the back. You'll see this loop here matching the rest of your loops. That will tell you that you're all lined up and ready to go. The continental method for knitting uses your working yarn in your left hand versus using it in the right hand, which is what you're probably used to seeing people knit. Using the yarn in your right hand is called the English method, and while you're doing your knit stitches, you'll be throwing your yarn over the knitting needle. Now that doesn't seem like a whole lot of work while you're creating a stitch, but if you keep doing that for every stitch, you end up with a lot of wrist motion, and that causes wear and tear on your joints. I find that the continental style, holding your yarn in the left hand, is a lot less wear and tear. To set up your yarn in your left hand, I start with wrapping the yarn around my little pinky, all the way around one full loop, bringing the yarn over my ring finger, under my middle finger, and over the index finger. Then I hold my finger against my knitting needle and slide my stitches up towards the point. Underneath, when you pull on the working yarn, that helps to snug up the yarn and keep the tension even across the fingers. Taking your other needle in your right hand, we'll be putting the needle through the first stitch, front to back. And I'll show you the back side here. Now, using your index finger with the yarn, slide your yarn around the tip of the needle counterclockwise. Using your right finger, hold the yarn and pull the yarn back through the loop that you put your needle through and slide the loop off. Now, first stitch is now on your right needle. And do the same and keep on going, and that's how that's done. Front to back, slide around, hold with your fingertip, and slide the stitch off. When you get going faster, you don't always need to hold the needle, or the yarn, with your right index finger, like this. Your tension should help keep it steady so that you can just slip the needle off without using your fingertip. This style is a whole lot easier on your arms, your hands, your wrists, and just really goes a lot faster too. And there we are. Nice and even. That's the knit stitch using the continental method. For more knitting tips, go to allfreeknitting.com. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.